Okay, so after we've gone through a couple of agencies, we've talked about the Heritage Foundation, sort of the history of the organization, what exactly they were looking to do with this conservative mandate, and we have 4 days before the election. So I really want to be almost rapid fire with a lot of this stuff, because it's important that as we are wrapping up the electoral work, the get out to vote work, it's now really important that we understand what is in this conservative mandate. Okay, I want to now talk about the Environmental Protection Agency. So one of the things about the Environmental Protection Agency is that it is of all the agencies, this is probably the one that is the most technical, because it is very heavily science-based. You're dealing with pesticides, fungicides, regulatory stuff, biological agents in water and in the air. And so I'm going to do the best that I can to kind of thumb through this without a lot of the jargon, but we're going to have to kind of dive into it, because I think it's important that we do understand exactly what they're talking about and how it will impact you. So let's go. So, diving into this very carefully, because once again, the Environmental Protection Agency is probably one of the most jargon-laden of all of the departments. And one of the things that the Conservative Heritage Foundation wants us to know is that a conservative EPA will track success by measured progress as opposed to the current perpetual process, and will convey this process to the public in a clear, concise terms. What? Wait. And this is written in English, so work with me, guys. We're going to track success by measured progress. How about track success by people not getting sick? How about track success by not having pesticides in drinking water? How about tracking success by reducing greenhouse emissions, or, because I know that's a little too controversial, how about not dumping toxins into a Superfund site? Do I need to remind everyone about Toms River, New Jersey, and the cluster of carcinogens that happen among people as young as infants because of contaminated waters from a Superfund site? The same Superfund site executives that were cozying up with state officials. That is what would happen if we returned EPA regulations to local control. I got more. So, to continue, the new EPA would balance justified skepticism towards an agency that has long been amenable and has been co-opted by the left. So my question is, who has skepticism of the Environmental Protection Agency? Who in the world would be skeptical of the Environmental Protection Agency? Of the agency that makes sure that, I don't know, when we go outside, that we're not breathing in emissions from power plants. The same agency that makes sure that when we go to the beaches and the lakes, that we're literally not swimming in raw sewage. Who is skeptical of this? Who is skeptical of this? I'm sure the citizens of Georgia, who just dealt with a fire at a chemical plant, would not be skeptical of this. So who would be skeptical of the EPA regulating air, water, land, soil, Who would be skeptical of this? Well, they say it here. Embedded activists, that's something they're going to say a lot in this chapter, is that the EPA is just full of activists, right? And last I checked, activists usually are members of the community, and members of the community who have been aggrieved in some way, who are exercising their First Amendment right to protest. Those activists, right, okay. Implementing costly policies. Ha-ha. That's it. The skeptics of the EPA are the people who don't like costly policies and regulations. And they also talk a lot about risk versus fear-based policymaking and a diversity of scientific thought. So when we started down this road, I wanted us to be very careful of language and to be very mindful of how language is used in this document. And the one thing that comes up a lot in this section on the Environmental Protection Agency is diversity of scientific thought. Right. Because science is about diverse thought. Can we go back to the scientific method for a second? Because one thing about science, especially bench science, and remember, when we're talking about the Environmental Protection Agency, this is one of the most scientific laden agencies. There is no diversity in that. A chemical either is dangerous or it's not dangerous. It either is a carcinogen or it is not a carcinogen. It either is poisonous to wildlife and fisheries or it isn't. And we can argue the degree and the concentration of it and synergistic effects, and that's a big word to just say that everything is kind of like grouped in together. If you have one chemical and two chemicals and you put those chemicals together and they emit a gas, that particular gas is going to be a chemical. And that chemical could potentially be toxic to humans to inhale. That is the level of work that the EPA has to do. But if you can imagine for a second, if I own a power plant and my power plant kicks out emissions, every chemical that is emitted from my power plant through the smokestack into the waterways, into the soil, has to be accounted for. And that process, it's pretty expensive, right? It's pretty expensive. So the diversity of scientific thought might be, hey, guess what? That methane is not that bad. We don't have to measure that. We don't have to regulate. Let's take that back to the States. Why do we gotta measure all of these chemicals coming out of a smokestack? Why? Don't know. But the Heritage Foundation thinks that we need more diversity because apparently the science that's literally science. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm back. The other thing too that came up is that they attempted to bring in some historical events, and one of them was, of course, the Flint water crisis. Remember that? By the way, I don't think Flint still has clean water. I think that people just gave up. Now everyone's using bottled water in Flint. So it's just done, right? You know, an American city. Let's keep going. The other thing that the EPA wants us to know, the Heritage Foundation wants us to know about the EPA, is that we need to get back to basics. Because what has happened is all of these damn scientists and chemical engineers and physicists are making it difficult for good old-fashioned business owners who just want to make money for their families and pump toxins into the air. That's why we need diversity in scientific viewpoints. If only we had diversity, then we would know that, methane ain't that bad. The EPA structure and mission should be greatly circumscribed to reflect the principles of cooperative federalism and limited government. No. I'm sorry, yes, that's what they said. I'm going to reread that because I think it's important. The EPA structure and mission should be greatly circumscribed to reflect the principles of cooperative federalism and limited government. Again, the Environmental Protection Agency, it involves the air we breathe, the water we drink, consume, cook with, bathe our children in, the land that we grow vegetables, we walk on, and to some degree, fisheries and wildlife. And they want to take it back to the states. Last I checked, I'm in Chicago. If there's a Superfund site in Hammond, Indiana, that is emitting toxic gases, does it magically just stop at the end of the border? Does it just kind of come up to the border and say, oh, that's Illinois, we're not going to go there. We're going to blow back this way? No, it doesn't. And this is the problem. So the one thing that's very interesting about this is that there is also an emphasis on tribal lands. And one of the things that the Heritage Foundation's mandate for the EPA states is that native lands need to be responsible for their own waste dumping and environmental protections. Again, one of the things that has happened with the EPA is protections of tribal lands. It's embedded in the EPA. But one thing that has happened over and over again is whenever drilling has happened or any type of fracking has happened on tribal lands, people are saying, no, you cannot drill here. You cannot dump here. And there are people who feel that far too much of the United States land is unused because of what they perceive as antiquated tribal laws governing environmental protections. And so what the Heritage Foundation suggests we do is to just leave it to the tribal lands. And if you have someone who wants to negotiate with the developer to come and dump, who are we to say no? And in no way is this an attempt to paternalize tribal lands. But when I think of that, I think of communities like the Yavasupai and the Grand Canyon. And what will be done to that area if the current tribal protections are circumvented? So earlier in the presentation, I mentioned a statement that's very much peppered throughout this agency not the agency, the chapter. My words are running together. Come on, Sasha, work with me. The idea that things have to become more risk-based than precautionary, and the diversity of scientific thought. So at the core of all of this, all 50 pages, I think, I printed out from the EPA, double-sided, my poor printer, oh my God. Those two concepts sort of overarch what the EPA will look like under Project 2025. Diversity of scientific thought, risk-based versus precautionary-based, meaning science. And the third one is local control of environmental protections. So let's start with the first global theme of the Environmental Protection Agency's Project 2025, and that is the diversity of scientific thought. This idea that science is somehow open to interpretation is wild to me. It's wild to me. That is like saying that, hey, I've been breathing oxygen all of my life. Let's see what happens if we substitute oxygen for radon. Because someone said on Jupiter that they're breathing radon. That is the equivalent of diversity of scientific thought. That is the equivalent. Certain things are what they are. Okay, remember in the beginning I stated the EPA is probably the most scientific kind of, laden of the departments. The next concept that I want to really hammer home to people is this idea of federalism and local control. And again, if you're pumping out toxic gas from a Superfund site in one state, that stuff doesn't necessarily stop at the state border. So by virtue of the term environmental, it can impact people beyond your state borders. Therefore, the idea of local control of environmental emissions and no. I just, it's not my opinion. I'm just reporting the news, guys, okay? And yes, every state has their own environmental departments. But usually, when you're talking about large-scale projects, you have to make sure that you are protecting the environment, not just the border around your state. Next, this idea that things become risk-based versus kind of precautionary. And I read that several times, and two things came out of that for me with the risk-based. One of them was kind of partnering with that scientific diversity idea, meaning that, well, some countries still use DEET. Why can't we use DEET? Because we have regulations that won't allow us to use it because it's a carcinogen. And actually, the other countries who still use it should stop using it as well. So that was the one thing I got from risk. The other thing I got from risk was market risk. It is expensive to regulate an industry. It is expensive to account for every chemical that can potentially be produced in a factory that produces, paper clips or Post-it notes or, meat processing, anything. The gases, the emissions into the air, the dumping into waters, the solid waste. All of that has its own set of environmental potential hazards that has to be accounted for. I can imagine how expensive that is. I also know that it's probably important that we invest in that. And of course, I could not have a conversation about the Environmental Protection Agency and a conservative mandate without talking about climate change. All three of those kind of overarching themes, diversity and scientific thought, federalism and local control of environmental regulations, and a risk-based versus a fear-based, as they called it, but it's really not a fear-based. It's actually based on science that this stuff is a problem. It all kind of culminates around climate change. So the one thing that the Heritage Foundation wants us to do is to remove the greenhouse gas reporting program. Why do we even need it, right? Why do we even need to report it? If we don't report it, then we can't say it's a problem. Remember, diversity in thought, right? Diversity in scientific thought. Science, for the most part, is based on evidence. If you remove the potential to collect evidence, you now have no evidence. And therefore, you can just make new evidence or report the absence thereof. So that's kind of what I got for the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm just going to kind of do a rapid fire about all the things that are potentially going to be impacted this. Definitely climate change is like top on the list. We also have air, water. We also have automobile emissions is going to be impacted through this. Fisheries, waterways, dumping, Superfund dumping. Superfund sites are just big processing sites. The idea that the American Indian Office can actually decide what what happens with that, and I don't have a problem with that, but I think that is an open door for exploitation. I'm gonna be very honest with you. I just find that is an open door for exploitation, because as it is now, tribal lands are heavily protected by the EPA from drilling, dumping, emissions, and sort of building these plants. They're going to regulate radon. They're going to regulate the chemicals and the cosmetics that you use. So that MAC, Charlotte Tilbury, all of that stuff, it doesn't need to make sure it goes through, environmental checks. Just as long as it looks good and you can sell it, sell it. And then finally, let's go back to what happened just recently in the state of Georgia. There was a huge environmental issue with a processing plant, a chemical plant, of all plants, that caught fire. Could you imagine if there were no regulations? Could you imagine if the EPA had not been involved in that cleanup, in that process? I have loved ones who live in the Atlanta area, and I still am concerned about the long-term respiratory effects of that fire. But that is what the EPA does. And if you're someone who wants to just build and dump and burn, you might not like those kind of regulations. So again, Heritage Foundation, I'm going to ask, who doesn't like the EPA? Who finds the EPA problematic? I think we know the answer.